Good evening, everyone who has joined us. Let me very briefly introduce our speaker today, and then I'll yield the floor to Anat. Anat Pick is a reader in film and at Queen Mary University of London, and a research fellow at the Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies at the University of Helsinki, Finland. She is author of Creaturely Poetics, Animality and Vulnerability in Literature and Film, and co-editor of Screening Nature, Cinema Beyond the Human, and Religion in Contemporary Thought and Cinema. Her most recent work addresses the links between vegan ethics and film. She's currently writing a book on the religious philosophy of Simone Weil and cinema. And today's talk is called Kelly Reichardt's Gastro-Aesthetics. I think I butchered a few names as I was doing the bio, but I'm sure you will correct me in your talk. So I feel confident about people hearing the right way to explain it all. Anat, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Marta. Thanks a lot for inviting me. And thanks also to Christina, who I think was part of the invitation. And I see that Michael is here as well. This talk actually originated in a different talk that I gave at the Center for Contemporary Art maybe a couple of years ago. I don't know. Sense of time is totally warped. So there's some elements of that first talk are still here in setting up the premise, and then I move on to discussing Kelly Reichardt's most recent film, First Cow. So the title is Kelly Reichardt's Gastro-Aesthetics, and there's a subtitle that is about the two palates. The palate and palate sound the same, spelt differently. You'll see it in terms of the kind of gastronomic or culinary palate, and the palate, the artistic palate of the film. And basically my talk is about how these two palates relate to one another through the figure of the cow. Okay, so a number of recent films, including Victor Kosakovsky's Gunda, that came out in 2020, and Andrea Arnold's Cow, that also came out in 2020, as well as Kelly Reichardt's First Cow from 2019. So all of these films feature farmed animals at their core, at their center. In the longer version of this talk, I address these films as different iterations of this thing that I'm calling gastro-aesthetics, by which I mean the different iterations or different exchanges between the visual and the elementary in these films. More specifically, I see each of these three films, Cow, Gunda, and First Cow, each of them as grappling with the depiction of farmed animals whose visibility is circumscribed by their status as food or as food animals. In its own way, each of these examples queries the epistemic, moral, and visual frameworks that shape our perception of farmed animals while never fully escaping them. First Cow tells the story of a friendship between the reluctant trapper-cum-cook named Cookie Figowitz and an entrepreneurial Chinese immigrant called King Lu, and it takes place, it's a historical drama set in the American frontier in the early 19th century. The two friends, Cookie and King Lu, set up a business selling mouth-watering oily cakes, as they're called, to fellow settlers. But to sustain their venture, they resort to stealing milk from the first cow in the territory, who's owned by a pompous English landowner called Chief Factor. When their crime is uncovered, the pair goes on the run. First Cow opens with the accidental discovery of two skeletons in present-day Oregon. And the rest of the film is set in the past, in the 1820s, and it sort of circles back to what we presume. In the end, we realize during the film that what we saw in the beginning, in the contemporary moment, the two skeletons are indeed Cookie and King Lu's burial site. An anti-Western and an anti-heist film, at the heart or the stomach, as it were, of First Cow, is the intoxicating presence of dairy. And I'll show you the trailer just in case some of you haven't seen it, just to give you a feel or a flavor of the film.
Who's there? Hello? You all right?
Hungry. There are some men chasing me.
This is a land of riches, I tell you.
It's the getting started that's the puzzle. No way for a poor man to start.
Saw a cow today.
First cow in the territory.
This ain't a place for cows.
It's no place for white men either.
I sense opportunity here.
Seems dangerous.
So is anything worth doing?
Damn it, what's in this thing?
I taste London in this game.
Some people can't imagine being stolen from.
And like us, Cookie. We have to make our own way.
Okay, so First Cow has something in common with the temporalities of what Laura McMahon has called slow animal cinema, films that focus on farmed animals rather than wildlife, and deploy what McMahon calls temporal distension, a kind of stretching of time, long, slow takes that tamper with human conventions of narrative and allow the subjective life worlds of animals to emerge within and even through the agricultural apparatuses that confine them. But although Reichardt has said that her film adjusted itself to the bovine rhythms of its titular cow, the cow, remains at best an inscrutable minor character. The cow is caught between Reichardt's tendency towards the self-revelation of the film world, what Laura Staab has called Reichardt's spirit of withdrawal, and the more forthright, extractive approach that sees the cow as a visual and gastronomic commodity. A laboring body whose productive and reproductive capacities are harnessed, indeed milked, for culinary and visual pleasure. With Reichardt's film, I want to think through the cinematic figurations of food, what I'm calling the gastro-aesthetics of cinema. My thinking takes its cue from two sources. The first, as was mentioned, is the work of the philosopher Simone Weil and her analogy between looking and eating. And the second source is the resurgent theoretical interest in food. And I'll just name just a few books that have come out in the last decade or so. For example, Parama Roy's absolutely dazzling book, Alimentary Tracts, that is subtitled Appetites, Aversions, and the Post-Colonial. It came out in 2010. More recently, Anna Marie Moll's Eating in Theory, Nicola Perula's Taste as Experience, and of course, earlier than that, Derrida's work on so-called eating, on the phrase eating well, to which Donna Haraway, who I'm going to talk about a little bit in this talk, also alludes. So there's a growing body of work on the kind of philosophy of food and of eating that takes the alimentary seriously. I'd like to consider cinema's dual impulse to look and to eat, to preserve and devour the world within and beyond the frame. The tension between looking and eating emerges in Reichardt's approach to farmed animals, whose agency is undermined, whose labor is naturalized or invisibilized, and whose bodies are the products of consumption, both actual consumption and visual consumption. First Cow converges aesthetic and gastronomic consumption in the figure of the cow as an image and a source of milk. The film presents us with the question of how do we think about the visual consumption of images of dairy consumption? From River of Grass came out in 1994, and Reichardt's first film, through to Wendy and Lucy in 2008, to First Cow, animals are ubiquitous in Reichardt's cinema. Yet while dogs in films like Old Joy and Wendy and Lucy display an autonomy and agency, and they sort of exemplify Reichardt's signature aesthetics of contingency, just kind of letting things happen in front of the camera. Farmed animals in her film Night Moves from 2013, in Certain Women in 2016, and here in First Cow, farmed animals remain in a sort of slightly different regime of visibility. In film as in life, they're a source of value extraction, and therefore they're, I think, treated somewhat differently by the camera. And this is what I mean by the two palettes. So in the two slides you can see here on the screen, it's maybe a little bit difficult to discern because of the sort of the dark. The film is quite dark, but the figure on the left is the dog that discovers the skeletons, and then we have an image of the cow towards the end of the film who's literally confined in this kind of agricultural enclosure to stop others from accessing her milk. The role of the dairy cow in First Cow, I claim, conjoins the film's culinary palette and artistic palette. The gentle sociality at the heart of First Cow and the film's exploration of nonviolence in the midst of a harsh environment of the American frontier are subtended by agricultural colonial practices that control and consume animals and indigenous people. As an image, then, the cow of First Cow comprises the convoluted histories of settler colonialism and dairying in the United States. So before I turn to Reichartt's film, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of gastronomy or the gastro-aesthetic. So my use of the term is really two-pronged. It is first a response to the fact of animals' rampant visual consumption that recasts the visual as edible. And second, it invokes the similarities and differences between the respective apparatuses of farming and of film, the parallels between film stock and livestock, if you will. In her book, Animal Capital, Nicole Shukin expertly tracks the different, quote, points of complicity between the symbolic economies of slaughter and cinema, end quote. For Shukin, the technologies of moving pictures and the disassembly line of the abattoir are historically and materially linked through the presence of gelatine in the film strip and the real-life slaughterhouse tours that took place in the late 19th century. And these tours offered people a kind of sequence of moving images along the production line of meat. And Shukin points out brilliantly that these tours of the abattoirs kind of mimic the sequential logic of cinema, of moving pictures. So whereas in cinema you have an assembly line, in the abattoir you have a disassembly line. This covert dependence on animal remains marks what Shukin calls cinema's, quote, pathological relationship to animal life, end quote, a pathology not fully resolved in the move from photographic to digital filmmaking. Shukin's bleak assessment of the material conditions of film production is a cornerstone of animal cinema studies and informs my own understanding of the politics of milk in First Cow. But cinema's elementary entanglements are often ambiguous and remain open to a range of possibilities of multi-species relations that are not strictly violent. One such non-violent conflation between looking and eating is what I've previously written about, and this is the talk I gave 2 years ago in Warsaw, is what I call vegan cinema, and what I'm sort of trying to elucidate in the book that I'm writing. And by vegan cinema, I don't mean films about veganism. I mean films that somehow show cinema's grappling with its own devouring instincts, with its own kind of carnivorous relationship to the objects of sight. This is a cinema that practices what we might think of as visual abstinence or abstention. Before turning to Reichardt's fascinating case of gastro-cinema, I want to briefly discuss what it means to reclaim cinema's non-devouring potential against the backdrop of Shukin's very bleak assessment of cinema's pathology. So a vegan philosophy of film, if it existed, would hinge on the parallels between consumption of animal images and animals' physical consumption as food. Turning animals into food and into spectacle are literal and interconnected forms of appropriation. Although, as I hope to make clear as I go along, looking and eating diverge when we look at an object without wishing to eat it. Both animal flesh and animal images are products of invasive processes of value extraction from the living bodies of animals. So vegan aesthetics asks how to deal with this relentless subjection of animals to the human look, whilst also resisting a sort of iconoclasm, which carries its own form of violence, that would kind of get rid or reject images altogether. And as someone who writes about film and teaches film, my primary material is, of course, visual. And since I consider teaching and scholarship as a kind of slow advocacy, my work partly reflects my own situatedness as an ethical vegan who's teaching film. And I'm kind of trying to figure out, to work through my own difficulties of working with animal imagery as an ethical vegan. As Parma Roy's brilliant analysis of Gandhi's vegetarianism in the book that I mentioned earlier, Elementary Tracts, as Roy shows, dietetic ethical choices are also choices of style. They're always bound up in performances of a range of things like gender, nation, religion, class, and so on. So vegan aesthetics is related to vegan politics and a vegan aesthetics, and I'm trying to bring all of these things together. A little bit like Gandhi, although very different, Simone Weil's life and work are also marked by a preoccupation with eating and abstention from eating. So some of you may know that she was born in 1909, but she died at the age of 34 in 1943 from complications of tuberculosis and the refusal of food. And there's debates and conversations among her biographers about whether or not she had an eating disorder, and also whether that's an important thing to know, how it sort of influences our understanding of her thought. Eating and hunger in Vey work both metaphorically and as an embodied or somatic practice. On the one hand, eating stands for various kinds of appropriation, but very often in Vey, eating is literal. She's writing about food and she just means food. Gastro-Aesthetics suggests that eating itself already conflates the biological with moral dimensions of being. Of special importance is the analogy Vey draws between looking and eating, on which rest many of her theological, ethical, and aesthetic ideas, what amount to a kind of gastro-philosophy. At stake for Vey in all of her work is the issue of being able to perceive reality adequately, how we might perceive the mechanism of the world from our limited, self-serving perspective, which is quite a common question in philosophy, but what makes Vey's formulation of it quite unique is that she casts it through the story of eating. So she asks how we might perceive the world outside of our own interests and desires, and outside of our hungry ego that wants to devour everything that is before us. Most of the time, Vey believes we gape at the world with our mouth as much as with our eye, from the perspective of our hunger, of our appetite. We look as if we're eating, assimilating the objects that we look at into our own ways of seeing, destroying their specificity and singularity in the process. In distinction from most plants, humans and most animals destroy what we eat to sustain and enhance ourselves. Eating, writes the plant philosopher Michael Marder, is inherently unethical. A violent destruction of the immediate autonomy of the eaten incorporated into the eater, end quote. Far from claiming to resolve once and for all the moral problem of eating, veganism, as I see it, amplifies it by transcending the dietary. So if veganism is about more than just eating, this is because the problem of eating is about more than just eating. The problem of eating really exemplifies the problem of being. Is it ethical to eat, continues Martyr, justifiably resonates in our ears in the form of a more profound question: is it ethical to be? So, is it ethical to eat is really the question: is it ethical to be? And a vegan aesthetics considers what it might mean to gaze non-violently, to look without devouring the objects of our gaze, to separate the eye that sees from the mouth that feeds. In her book, Waiting for God, Weil writes that human depravities and crimes are nearly always, in their essence, attempts to eat beauty, to eat what one can only look at, end quote. She posits the beautiful as that which resists the advances of the voracious gaze. And she writes in her book, Gravity and Grace, the beautiful is a carnal attraction which keeps us at a distance and implies a renunciation. We want to eat all the other objects of desire, and the beautiful is that which we desire without wishing to eat it. We desire that it should be, end quote. So not eating the beautiful object for Weil protects its reality. As Peter Winch, one of Weil's most astute commentators, explains, he writes, the response to beauty is, in Weil's view, the pivot around which turns any understanding of the order of the world, end quote. The choice not to consume not only allows the other to be, but recognizes their reality is precarious, because whatever exists can and will be consumed. Existence itself is this vulnerability and openness to being devoured. Understood in this context, veganism doesn't escape the violence of being, but reframes it through the fraught recognition that others exist beyond any use I may wish to make of them. Contrary to common critiques of veganism, like the Donna Haraway's critique, for example, critiques that see veganism as purist or unrealistic, veganism's concern for what Martyr called the immediate autonomy of the eaten situates it in the thick materiality of worldly relationships. Now, in her essay, Forms of the Implicit Love of God, Weil describes the creative act as one of renunciation. She writes, on God's part, creation is not an act of self-expansion, but of restraint and renunciation. He emptied a part of his being from himself and permitted the existence of things distinct from himself. By this creative act, he denied himself. Although the religious dimensions of Weil's statement are important, in secular terms, we could say that the creative act is understood by her as a kind of impersonal act of self-contraction. Creating life in God's case, or a work of art, or anything else actually in our case, is for Weil an expression of earthly love that fulfills itself through self-contraction or self-denial. To really see things, whether other people or the natural world, means to see them as something other than the extensions of ourselves and our desires. This is for Weil to love the world as simply, or love reality as what is. And Weil calls this disposition attention, which I think also suits Kelly Reichardt's type of cinema, which is attentive to the world around it rather than appropriative of it. It's an attitude that entails a disruption of the will, in Weil at least, a moment of hesitation before the object, and crucially, an abstention from consuming it. Weil has this to say about the first woman, not the first cow, but she has the same name as the first cow, Eve. So Weil writes about Eve, the biblical Eve, and the eating of the apple. She writes, it requires the strength of soul that Eve did not have, and yet she had no need for the fruit. If she had been hungry at the moment when she looked at the fruit, and if in spite of that, she had remained looking at it indefinitely without taking one step towards it, she would have performed a miracle analogous to that of perfect friendship. End quote. Biblical misogyny aside, casting Eve as the wrongdoer, Weil elucidates here an aesthetics of distance that looks without devouring, and which also comes across as a particularly stringent interpretation of veganism. You don't eat your friends, even and especially if you're hungry. What is required is what Weil calls a strength of soul that Eve didn't have, that doesn't deny but sort of grapples with hunger. Had she been hungry, and in spite of her hunger, she didn't eat, Eve might have remained looking indefinitely. In so doing, she would have performed a miracle of analogous to perfect friendship. For Weil, unlike for Donna Haraway, what we stay with is not the trouble, but the hunger. So Haraway's much quoted phrase, and also the title of her book, Staying with the Trouble, suggests that we cannot escape the often violent complexities of eating others. In Weil, we are staying with the hunger, which is also a kind of trouble, but a different sort of problem. Abstention for Weil is then not simply an ascetic purification of our devouring impulses. On the contrary, I take it to mean being in touch with the urge to consume, postponed indefinitely, but not permanently, for the sake of friendship. Abstention itself is not the end, but the struggle with the will to consume. Reichardt's cinema, including her most recent film, takes seriously Weil's gastro-aesthetics of withdrawal and friendship, but it also reveals the limits of seeing someone as someone when it comes to filmed farmed animals. In a number of ways, First Cow grapples with questions of the visual and culinary consumption of animals. Alternating between the visual and the gastronomic, First Cow distinguishes between the two palettes. As I've said, the visual palette, the visual and the tonal palette, I would say, of the film, and the culinary and gastronomic ones. These two palettes intersect in the figure of the cow. The cow is image and emblem, and as a living body. One of the challenges that the film poses is the unresolved tension between its ecological sensibility that undermines strict divisions between human and non-human, that allows the natural world to reveal itself to the camera, and which also links colonial and ecological devastation. So that's on the one hand, and then on the other, you have Reichardt's approach to farmed animals, whose agency is obscured, and as I said before, whose labor remains largely out of sight or unacknowledged, and whose bodies are presented as ready sources of value extraction. So I take First Cow to be a kind of case study in a vegan philosophy of film. Its dairy-driven narrative not only tells the story of a fictional animal, but makes use of the labor of a real-life cow whose name happens to be also Eve. In the time that remains, I want to touch on three related points through which to think through these tensions that I've outlined. And the three pointers are: one, ecology and materiality; the second is animal labor; and the third is the film's critique of colonialism. So, point one, materiality. In its attention to the environment and the freedom afforded to the natural elements to simply be on screen, First Cow is a materialist tour de force. Nature unfolds before us in all its fragility and harshness. As in her previous films, Reichardt continues to explore the importance of landscape and the specificities of place. Here she returns to the familiar Oregon territory, whose climate and textures actively shape the identities of those living within them. Numerous commentaries call attention to Reichardt's environmental sensibility. I'll mention just a few. Mercedes Chavez, for instance, sees Reichardt's cinema as reflecting the problematics of the Anthropocene, the geological era of anthropogenic climate change, the man-made activities that are changing the very DNA of the ecosystem. Matthew Holtmeyer reads Reichardt as, quote, a bioregional filmmaker for whom people and place co-become or co-emerge together. When we first meet the protagonists, they appear as extensions of the surrounding vegetation. You can see that that's Cookie in surrounded by the vegetation. They are like sprouting figures amidst a thicket of green. What should we make of the film's more than human assemblages in light of its extractive approach to farmed animals? I agree with Chavez that, quote, the entanglement between the human and the landscape in Reichardt's films invites an Anthropocene reading, end quote. Reichardt's environmental sensibility decenters the human, but this is complicated by the film's thematics of dairy. The materialist aesthetic is poised against extraction. It lets the world reveal itself, observing it patiently through gestures of withdrawal, retreat, patience, the temporal distension that I talked about earlier, and also through immersing the human characters in the landscape. But the value extracted from livestock is largely unproblematized and so signals the film's lingering anthropocentrism. The opening epigraph by Blake, the bird, a nest, the spider, a web, man, friendship. This is the epigraph that sort of frames the entire film. Really helps us to center on the key preoccupation of the film with the topic of friendship, but it also forecloses the possibility of interspecies friendship or of human-animal allyships around the film's notion of class. It seems to operate as a kind of, at least to me, sort of this reads as a kind of humanist gaslighting. I think I read it and I think to myself, am I crazy or deluded to think that this cow could be more than just livestock or film stock? Could not the cow be a friend? Point 2, labor. Reichardt's nuanced understanding of capitalism places great emphasis on labor and class. As Bessie Rubenstein notes, quote, the dream of benefiting from one's own labor, pursuing one's own ambitions, opening a hotel for Cookie and operating a farm for King Lu relies on capital that the poor man lack, end quote. So as they have no money, Cookie and King Lu, they rely on stolen milk to continue to produce and sell their product. And they're encouraged by the fact that their oily cakes, as you could see in the trailer, the oily cakes take the small outpost by storm, offering deep-fried indulgences to ease the harsh conditions of life. The world of the film is one of economic, social, and ecological instability. So the film captures a moment of transition, also in terms of capitalism. So people are using money and they're also bartering. But we also have this sort of oscillation between subsistence and luxury. So the oily cakes are the first arrival of this idea of consuming something just for pleasure rather than for sustenance. There's an oscillation between use value and exchange value, between scarcity and abundance. Rich, milky confections affect a profound change in consciousness. As my colleague Yasmin Feda put it, the arrival of dairy in the territory makes people go a little crazy. The near high provided by the oily cakes, their addictiveness, is of course indispensable to capitalism. Like the opium and tea-driven British Empire in Paramoroy's thrilling account in Elementary Tracks, milk is more than just food. It is, to quote Roy, an appetitive and phantasmal substance underlining the non-utilitarian, debilitating, and uncontrollable cravings it simultaneously incites and exploits, end quote. Look hard enough, and you could see the milk line stretch all the way from Oregon to Krispy Kreme and Dunkin' Donuts. Cookie and King Lou's business venture might be ill-fated, but it's also integral to their friendship and a way out of old world class hierarchies. For Reichardt, what I'm trying to say is that her view of capitalism is quite ambivalent and is positive in part, and I think rightfully so. She's very much aware of the progressive powers of capitalism. And moreover, she sees capitalism as a living, breathing American landscape. So I think capitalism and the natural landscape sort of parallel one another in this film. Much of the film concerns the careful and caring observation of different kinds of waged and unwaged labor. There's hunting and foraging, there's cooking and homemaking, even clever marketing. So King Lu in the market makes up this this lie saying that the recipe for the oily cakes is the result of it comes from an ancient Chinese recipe. So it's kind of an early example of branding or of marketing, because he's incredibly shrewd. Chief Factor, the English owner of the cow, speaks of indentured servitude. So this is a word in which indentured servitude and possibly also slavery still exist. So amidst these various forms of labor, the cow's own labor, while in some sense completely visible and self-evident, is hardly recognized as labor. Catherine Gillespie's study of the US dairy industry helps understand the uniqueness of farmed animal labor. Gillespie explains that animal labor, this is Gillespie, animals labor in the production of commodities, milk, eggs, semen, but they're also themselves commodities. As what is sometimes called a lively commodity, as lively commodities, the value of farmed animals is, quote, derived from their status as living beings. And as the name suggests, livestock, again, Gillespie says, brings new lively commodities into being, thus reproducing the commodity circuit, end quote. In the film, importantly, the absence of the bull threatens the continuity of the cow's lactating cycle. But First Cow, of course, the film, relies on the actual labor and reproductive labor of the non-fictional Eve, the non-fictional cow. Watching Eve's arrival on the small barge in the film, I immediately think of what it took to get her there. The hours of training to acclimate her to the unsteady surface before loading her onto the shaky raft, the fact that cows don't swim and she's on the river, the bustling presence of equipment and crew, but also the pregnancy that would have preceded her actual milking, which happens in the film, her actual milking and the removal of her calf, whose real loss is weirdly mirrored in the fiction. So Eve's physical and effective labor is part of an unsettling feedback loop between the world within the film and the world outside of the film, the world of the production. The gentleness with which Cookie uses the cow is mirrored in Eve's use in the production of the film. That there's been a lot of writing about that. Many people have talked about Eve, the star, Eve, the actress, and all of them, of course, stress the humaneness with which she was treated on set, which, of course, I take at face value and don't dispute. But this focus on gentleness that I'm going to talk about a little bit here, this focus on gentleness and tenderness conceals the prerequisites of the working life of a dairy cow, repeated pregnancies, and the removal of her calf, removal of her child. But while the labor of humans is legible, the cow's productive and reproductive labor remains imperceptible. Cookie's gentleness suggests that we are in a kind of Harowan relational space, in an assemblage. It could be read as a kind of assemblage with the cow, where the cow is a sort of co-collaborator in the process. And indeed, I think this is how Cookie treats her. But however benign, gentleness leaves the cow's commodity status intact. And there's the one very striking scene where Cookie comes and milks the cow at night. And I'm not going to risk showing the clip, so I've just pulled out a few stills with the words that Cookie speaks to the cow. So he speaks softly to Eve, and his tender demeanor suggests that he sees Cookie. Sorry, he sees the cow as that Cookie sees the cow as more than simply a milk machine. So he's comforting her. He's telling her what a good, sweet girl you are, and here he's talking about explaining why he's turned up in the middle of the night, because he's stealing the milk. So he has to do it stealthily. So he arrives at night, pulls up a chair, and then milks her. And he says, "Sorry about your husband and your calf. It's a terrible thing." So although I understand that this scene is kind of meant to be read as corroborating Cookie's gentleness and his empathy as a character. Something in the scene is very troubling to me. And again, this is perhaps something to do with my own situatedness, but what the problem is for me is that these comforting words about the loss of her husband and child cover up the specifically gendered violence of milk production. The sequence resonated with me in a very disturbing way, almost as a grooming scene. It because I find Cookie's soothing of the cow a way of kind of relaxing her into submission and even complicity with her own instrumentalization. Now, the grooming analogy may seem extreme to you, but I would ask you to remember that forced impregnation of female cows, like the semen extraction from male cows, these things are necessary in all large-scale or small-scale dairy production. So all of these things are kind of in the air here for me. When it comes to farmed animals, then, the film's stylistics of gentleness are, at least to me, ambivalent. Reichardt's, or ambiguous rather. Reichardt's commitment to gentleness is surely subversive. One need only compare First Cow to The Revenant, maybe a similar film from 2015, but The Revenant is a film that is mainly about is brutal and harsh and kind of demonstrates a lot of sort of frontier machismo. The settlement in this film is a hodgepodge of eccentrics, a far cry from the stock characters of, say, a John Ford Western. Gentleness is apparent in the intimacy between Cookie and King Lou, and I think it's made even more queer because it's actually not a sexual relationship. So it's a relationship that really escapes categories. And gentleness is also apparent in Cookie's homemaking efforts. So, for example, he picks flowers to brighten up King Lou's hut. And it's also there in the camera's non-devouring presence from Reichardt's side. Early on in the film, there's a scene in which Cookie encounters a lizard that's overturned. And Cookie, very gently, we see him flip her over and we see her kind of scurrying away. And in film comment, for example, describes this particular scene as, quote, a minute gesture of kindness that defines both Cookie, the character, and the character of the film. So again, this is all true, but in the context of milking, gentleness also facilitates animal docility and ensures better yield. It thus operates as a kind of soft power that obscures the inherent and attended violences of dairy. The last point that I want to talk about is colonialism. And this is where I think that in a way, First Cow is most successful. Where I find the coded narrative of milk to be sort of the most illuminating is in its treatment of colonialism. Through the figure of the single cow, Reichardt captures European encroachment into historically lactose intolerant territories. The film's title and its framing from the point of view of the present suggests a knowingness of things to come, the growth, consolidation, and intensification of the US dairy industry. Between the then of the 1820s and the now of the film's prologue, the cow has become an all-American symbol. And, you can only just have to think about, cookies and milk, and the idea of the dairy production and dairy consumption is a kind of all-American trope. But official accounts of the settling of the American West often omit the role of animals, and in particular cows, in the colonial project. In the early 17th century, English colonists were thrilled to discover rich grasslands in various points in America, I think beginning in Virginia, which were just excellent for cattle grazing. But cattle were also a technology of empire building. Fencing and land clearing, Gillespie writes, were primary modes of seizure and enclosure of land and resources, justified by needing to clear the land for ranching. Mathilde Cohen claims that, quote, by displacing local fauna, altering native weeds, seeds, grasses, cultivates, ranching and dairying altered New World ecosystems and advanced European purposes. And Mathilde Kahn describes this as a kind of biological invasion that disrupted the lives of native people and native environments. Jonathan Saha calls milk a, quote, conquering colonial commodity, part and parcel of the reshaping of space, of diet, and modes of production. All this is to say that the displacement of indigenous people and environmental destruction are well underway in the world of First Cow. The film's most vociferous critique of the folly of European voraciousness is actually spoken not in English, not in a European language, but in the Chinikawa jargon. It's a jargon or a language which is actually a hybrid indigenous trade language of the Pacific Northwest, and it's currently being revived. So there are still not many, but people who are speaking it and teaching it. In a scene in Chief Factor's house, and this is the scene, the Chinook First Nation dignitary mocks the white Europeans for their mindless eradication of beavers. So there's a conversation in the film about whether or not beaver is an endless resource, and the native dignitary speaks in Chinikawa and says something that isn't actually subtitled, it's not translated, and then Chief Factor's wife, played by Lily Gladstone, you can see her here on the bottom right, gives what we assume is a translation of what he said, and she says, why do white hunters hunt so much beaver and never eat the tail? So on the one hand, it's kind of excess of violence, on the other hand, completely wasteful, because they're not actually using what they're hunting. So to conclude, my conclusion really moves from the first analogy that I made between the film and the farm towards a slightly different analogy between film and the animal sanctuary. In his essay Sanctuary, Timothy Patcherat writes that humans, quote, exercise violence against other animals along two distinct yet synergistic fronts: an extensification of existential threats to wild animals and an intensification of domination over domesticated animals, end quote. In light of the current concerted, escalating, apparently unstoppable assaults on animals in the natural world, a discussion of the aesthetics of works of art featuring animals might seem a little bit less urgent. But while there's a long tradition that, of course, considers the connections between aesthetics, ethics, and politics, there are also case-specific reasons for speaking of aesthetics, animals, and film, and specifically farmed animals. First, in considering film as in an ecological context, we must attend to what is inside and outside the frame, what's in the image, but also how that image was sort of procured. Images are part of the world that made them possible and are accountable as such. Second, as I've tried to show, filming and farming are connected in intricate ways made manifest in films about farming. But if films and farms partake in the common practices of value extraction, the domestication, cultivation, processing, and consuming of animal life, film can become, and at times already is, a space of multi-species cooperation, resistance, and refuge. A sanctuary. In their study of Vine Sanctuary, Vine is an eco-feminist sanctuary for formerly farmed animals in Vermont, which is American dairy country, by the way. Charlotte Blandner, Sue Donaldson, and Ryan Wilcox describe Vine as a site of, quote, human-animal co-creation and co-authorship. What then if cinema were conceived as a sanctuary, not as a farm? What new multi-species protocols, images, subjectivities, and agencies could emerge from such an endeavor? Shifting our gaze from the farm to the sanctuary is also moving from eating to looking to letting be. It further suggests that relationality alone is not enough. If I may be permitted one final theoretical morsel, I'd like to develop this point by circling back to the different relations espoused by Vey and Donna Haraway. So in Staying with the Trouble that I mentioned earlier, Haraway writes, quote, "Eating each other properly requires meeting each other properly. A formulation of eating and being eaten whose symmetry, questionable symmetry, I would say, would, I think, have been alien to Simone Weil. In Weil, as discussed, we hold off from consuming the other, staying with the hunger, and abandoning the object to just be." Weil's creative renunciation contrasts with Haraway's generative contact zones. Most crucially for Weil, separation is the idiom of an encounter with the other, while for Haraway, it's entanglement. And I think this is pretty important because for Weil, the solution to the problem of violence seems to be separation, whereas for thinkers like Haraway, separation itself is the problem. These views also reflect the divergent aesthetics in animal cinema, and also I think within First Cow itself. I think First Cow kind of does both. Haraway and Weil, and to an extent also Reichardt, confront the problem of the devouring of the world by an imperial humanity. Weil responds through abstention from eating as a relation that lets the other be, while for Haraway, eating is part of the troubled and troubling multi-species encounter. I've been suggesting that Reichardt's cinema is poised between Weil and Haraway, between looking and eating, between separation and devouring. In its distended temporality and tactility, First Cow is open to the world as a more, in all of its sort of more than human vitality. Reichardt's alignment of content and form contests the various forms of violence we see in the film: male aggression, class and colonial, and environmental violence. Cookie and King Lou's friendship begins and ends in the soil. So I think, again, it's important that this is our first encounter with the two of them there. This is actually a very Haraway type image. They're embedded in the soil, in the earth. And yet, from beginning to end, the film upholds an exclusively human mode of sociality. In contrast to Reichardt's cinematic approach to dogs in Wendy and Lucy and other films, that dogs exercise quite a lot of freedom in her films. They're always unruly. They're kind of running around the frame, in and out of the frame. So they contest actually the containment of the limits of the frame. So unlike dogs, the cow is subjected to the controlling apparatuses like the barge or the enclosure that I showed in an earlier slide. And these apparatuses limit the cow's agency and render her a particular kind of cinematic object. In the face of Reichardt's attentiveness to colonial legacies and the subtleties of interspecies entanglements, this first cow, the first of so many, remains the film's obscure object of extraction. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk. I wanted to jump in with maybe the worst thing ever, not a question, but a comment. When you were talking about kind of the devouring and violent practices of cinema, I was immediately reminded of a very early film text, Sergei Eisenstein's film Strike, which I use very often to show my students kind of modernist technique, right, of the kind of montage and editing. And for the past couple of years, I started to give out a trigger warning before showing this because of the violence that's depicted to farm animals, right? And it turned out for me to be less of a teaching tool because of the violence towards animals that was depicted and the kind of the eyes that were watching, that my students, the eyes were watching this film that I think objected to this violating kind of camera eye that it did. So I wanted just to thank you for allowing me to think deeper about the reasons for that and the kind of philosophical underpinnings of that mechanism.
Yeah, thank you.
if you would like to respond, then please go
Yeah,
ahead.
just to say that, of course, yeah. I guess what I find interesting in First Cow is that it doesn't have any of that violence. There's, such a gentle, tender film. It's often commented upon as such. Its violence is kind of more is concealed, and it's partly the violence that enabled the film to be made. And I've done some deep diving onto like, where did Eve come from? It's a company called Talented Animals, also based in Oregon. And you follow the clues, and you're like, oh, okay, so they have this blog, and they announced that she's just had another baby, and the baby's been passed on to a farm, and you're like thinking, So it's kind of couched in this sort of fluffy and friendly and gentle discourse, unlike the Eisenstein, or unlike Edison's electrocuting of an elephant, which is another early example. So I'm interested in how these violences are kind of underpinning something that may be perceived differently by us, because the film is genuinely so heartwarming.
Exactly. And of course, the fact that only at some point in cinematic history, the announcement was made that, no animal was hurt in, shooting of that or other scene. I can see that Grzegorz Kość would like to make a comment. So please go ahead and mute yourself.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much for this great talk. I found it really inspiring, really interesting, even though I'm sort of out of my depth talking about this talk. But one remark you made me wonder if this is an accurate description of the phenomenology of cattle in the New World. You said that the cattle is the technology of the voraciousness of the colonizers, and I'm wondering if this is very accurate to say so, because at some point I was interested in this notion of dietary localism as a great threat to the colonizers. And dietary localism, this fear of new food, was something that really filled a lot of people with anxiety and really prevented them from going to the New World. If this is the case, I would imagine that the cattle was not an expression of the old world's voraciousness, but rather the cattle was an expression of the old world's effort not to eat, not to open themselves up onto the new world. If I were a farmer and I had to go to the new world, I would be quite scared of all these new plants, and I would rather have some species I know and am familiar with to eat it first, and then I would eat the species I know. Yeah. And I think it was important for the colonizers that a lot of the cattle was either brought from Mexico, from the Latin America, because it was the Spanish cattle brought by Columbus in the Spanish, or the cattle was brought from Canada. So the pilgrims brought their own cattle. So I think the understanding was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's a Jersey cow. I think that it was brought by the English.
All right.
I mean, the cow in the film. Yeah.
All right. For my money, the phenomenology of cattle at the time was to keep one's mouth rather closed and really eat something that is not the new world. That is not the new world anymore. Do you see?
Yeah. I completely see that. It's such a great. It's a great comment. Thank you so much. And I suppose it begs the question of whether colonialism as a movement of expansion was, I suppose, motivated by, it's not like you're going to discover new worlds, but you're also imposing your world on other places. It's not necessarily a kind of openness to the world. So I think you've introduced a sort of more nuance and complication to the the dynamics of eating and devouring, what it means to devour, because you're right. It was extending the old world into the new, for sure. And that's why, I mentioned this this English colonist who some of his diaries are in this book about the connection between colonialism and cattle. You read his kind of enthusiasm about discovering the new world, but really because it's like the old world. So they've just, I guess, run out of places in the old world, and they're moving into the conquest of space in the new world. But you're right, it's conservative as well.
I wanted to say that it's cautious, and therefore the mouth is partly closed, because you're eating the new world through the cow and not yourself, not by yourself, which is a lot riskier, and it makes you a lot more exposed.
Yeah, that's true. And I suppose it speaks to this idea of, what makes a genuine encounter, which involves being open to something. It involves eating the other, but being prepared to be eaten by the other. And colonialism is a very weird sort of articulation of that. But thank you. That's such a great thread to include here. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, Michał Matuszewski. Yep, go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Anat. So nice to see you, and it's great hearing. So I have one question and one comment or something. So the question maybe it's boring or methodological, but I'm just following the progress of your work, from the far distance, and you talked about vegan cinema, but I remember, maybe I'm wrong, but you mentioned that you don't want to use this term anymore, and you were shifting to cinema of letting be, and now you're talking about gastro-aesthetic, and my question is, are those different categories, or is it the progress in your work, or what how to treat these terms, categories? I don't know.
I mean, I think I published. I'm trying not to sort of just duplicate what I'm doing. So I have written about vegan cinema, and I suppose I think of all of these things as kind of not synonymous exactly, but just they have slightly different emphases, but they're all interconnected. And I use the gastronomic here because it's a theme in the film itself, whereas in Wendy and Lucy, there is eating in the film, but it's not purely about that. But here, what is interesting, as well as in Gunda and the new Arnold documentary, is that they're films about farmed animals, and there are many more actually. And so the culinary or the gastronomic is actually part of the film, what the film is about. I don't know if that answers.
Okay, so
I think when I finish the book, I'll know how to apportion.
Yeah.
It's partly, you're right. It's partly, I'm not sure. So I'm trying out, I'm tasting different concepts to see which one agrees with me.
Yeah, but it's always inspiring. I mean, and the second thing is I saw First Cow almost exactly 2 years ago at Berlinale at one of the first screenings, and my first thought after the screening was, oh my God, you need to see that, because and I wanted to contact you even, but then the pandemic started 2 weeks later, and I haven't. But so I was very looking forward. And when I thought that 2 years ago, I had in mind something which was also took from your essay and your thinking about vegan cinema and Kelly Reichardt's cinema, I mean, this still from Wendy and Lucy with the hand and an apple, and like just grabbing but not taking, letting be. And in so I'm surprised that you haven't mentioned that, because in actually in First Cow we have like this pattern all the time, almost like there was like many scenes of grabbing something or like reaching for something and not taking it, or taking it but after some moment of consideration of some, like very gentle, very tender. Like in one of the first scenes there is this picking of the mushrooms, like the yellow mushroom, very popular in Poland. But like it's like almost like in very many scenes we have this like hands grabbing for something and like almost letting it be, but not. But then like then taking it and eating it. So it's like kind of ambivalence. But I guess that like this in Reichardt cinema, this thing which was kind of like partly in Wendy and Lucy, but in this one scene here we have this. So I thought that okay, this could be like even better example of like what you meant in vegan cinema in this text like a few years ago, actually.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, I did have. I mean, yeah, the foraging and the way in which foraging is filmed, and actually a lot of the movement in the film when he walks as well is very slow and deliberate and sort of thoughtful. He treads very softly. Literally and metaphorically, he inhabits the world Cookie like very tentatively, and that is and that's also absolutely true in the way he forages for mushrooms and the way it's shot. The only reason I didn't talk about that is because like my focus was actually a kind of more critical view of the where the film doesn't meet, but in the longer version. Definitely, I contrast the two things, because like the difference between her depictions of farmed animals and dogs, she also is much more vegan in relation to these environmental entanglements and in relation to plants. And I think she embodies that's the other palette. And then in relation to farmed animals, it's kind of getting there, but it's not quite, doesn't quite work. For me anyway, it doesn't work as well. But so yeah, the mushrooms are in the longer version.
Thank you.
But I totally agree.
Thank you for that. I love the fact that I think your talk opens up the adjective vegan to mean so much more than I think it's kind of commonly used. And so I can see that there are two people who would like to pose questions. So first is Xin Liu. If you would like to unmute yourself.
Hi, Xin.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really, really great. I think I'll just ask a really small question right now.
I know your small questions. Your small questions are never small, but go for it.
It is actually very small. It's about the skeletons. Like since you began the introduction, and I don't know, the skeleton just stayed in my head until the end, and then you kind of came back to it. There's something about it. Like I start thinking about skeletons because in a way they refuse to be metabolized. Like there's almost like this resistance to be eaten. I mean, there's like, and so I was thinking, because you talked about the kind of the film as between the kind of relational and anti-relational dynamic. I'm not sure if that's the right interpretation of what you just said, but the idea that, Donna Haraway says we have to be absolutely entangled. That's like the ethical way versus, this separation as the ethical means of encountering the other. And then I start thinking about, well, skeleton is interesting because it's like, it's the remain of what refuses to be metabolized, to be eaten, to be relational, but still not completely anti-relational. And then I start thinking about Jose Munoz's argument about the queer theory's two different approaches to hope. One is exactly like, what Harry would say, this relational approach that we are all related and entangled, versus the anti-relational, no future kind of approach that argues for the negativity, argues for separation. And Munoz says we need to find an in-between ground that allows for critical modal hope. And I'm not sure if, that's the way you're saying, but I start thinking and then I start thinking about the skeleton, because what it seems to me is that it's not so much in between as it actually asks us to reconsider what relationality really is. And I'm not sure if I'm getting anywhere, because this is something I've been thinking for a long time, but I just felt that what if instead of thinking only simply about the possibility to be eaten or the vulnerability to allow oneself to be eaten, there's also another form of refusal that is somehow, like the skeletons. And in the end, they were allowing us to look at them, but we cannot consume them in the way that the other figures in the film have performed. I'm not sure if I'm getting anywhere. I'm sorry.
Wow, I knew it was going to be a huge question. You see I showed the skeletons at the end, but of course you see them in the beginning, and then in the end, the film ends with the pair lying down to rest when they're on the run and Cookie is injured. So the film ends with the kind of infleshed skeletons in the same position that you then realize, the skeletons appear in the same position. Okay, so now thinking about what you said, I wonder if other people, also there are people here who know queer theory much better than I do, would like to come in on this. But so are the skeletons a refusal of, so yes, there's something in the skeleton that refuses to be metabolized in the time scales that we inhabit, because ultimately it will be metabolized. So for me, the skeleton was, so just to say that the film is also based on a novel, and the novel spans a much, the novel is geographically, it goes to China and back, and it's much vaster, and the film is a kind of condensation. Actually, there's no cow in the novel either. But anyway, for me, the skeletons were kind of telegraphing the scales of time and changing and towards something more cosmic, a cosmic time scale that, because I don't know how long it takes for a skeleton to completely disappear. I have no idea, but so I think I like your idea of a third option between simply this kind of relationality, somewhat uncritical relationality, and maybe complete separateness. And are you saying that the skeletons may be a kind of image of that?
Can I reply quickly?
Yeah. I'm asking.
Okay. I need to talk to you about this later. But what I had in mind was, so you talked about abandonment. So, Weil argues that we have to abandon the other as a form of, letting be. And I've been working on abandonment because it's really interesting. Abandonment is like both it's both a form of separation, but also to abandon oneself in something is actually a complete surrender. So it's simultaneously a separation, but also can be read as a radical immersion in something else.
Yeah.
At the cost of oneself. So it's a dissolution of oneself, but also separate from something else. So for me, abandonment is super interesting because it allows for, unlike, the typical psychological discussion about, abandonment,
sure.
Abandonment actually reconfigures for me what relationality really is. Because relationality for me, thinking through abandonment, isn't simply about, the subject, the willful subject decides, okay, now I cut myself off from, the object, and therefore perform an ethical gesture towards the other. But it must necessarily also negates the subject itself. Also ask the question, where does the subject emerge or basically die? So that's why I was thinking about skeleton, because in a way it's not like you said, a skeleton is almost like maybe the figure of the holding the kind of staying with hunger, because like you said, it's kind of stretching the time of not eating, but ultimately maybe one will eat, may or may not. So it's kind of not entirely, the kind of oppositional logic that depicts relationality against the anti-relational. I think that allows something more ambiguous, but also maybe more troubling. That's what I had in mind.
Yeah, brilliant. I think my reading of Weil would really support what you're saying, because although she's a dualist and in her prose is very binary and she thinks like a dualist, but the result of her tearing apart of things, of her like absolute separations, are actually new forms of immersion, both immersion in the like quite like literally in her work, because God has abandoned us, he has immersed us in necessity and in materiality. That's why I find reading her with Haraway so interesting, because it's kind of like, as you're suggesting, it's a bit mind-boggling. You think you're rejecting relationality altogether through this figure of extreme separation, but then you end up in the different form of immersion. So like people are like, the abandonment creates a new, actually for her, abandonment is relationality, because she talks about separation as a medium for her to relate to God, but it doesn't matter if you don't have to bring God into it. So I would have to really talk to you more, maybe separately, about how the skeletons specifically fit into this. But I think you're on to something really important, which is why I find that image also very powerful in the film. It completely explodes the narrative timeframes and the story. It appeals to these skeletons have remained, and we are now witnessing this entire relationship between these two people over space, time, fictional universes. And, to take it back to animals, animals perhaps are not granted this form of remaining even in the industry. Although, of course, there are always animal remains. But yeah, thank you.
I mean, I think that for me, at least, this is also a weird kind of potential genre switch of this, as you said, very delicate genre that is very cautious about how it represents people and animals in various ways. And then we have a skeleton that, very often kind of is from a different mode of representation, right? Of violent representations or scary representations, but I can see that there is still a person waiting to ask his question. So Raymond, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. It's great to hear a talk centered in Oregon, which is where I'm from.
Wow.
So my question actually was asking you to kind of follow up on a point that you made about the title being First Cow, and the way in which it kind of gestures towards a pretty dramatic transformation in North American kind of agricultural practice. We're moving from individual cows, kind of small farming, to the kind of mega industry in and beyond Oregon in the present. I wondered what you thought about the filmmaker's decision to individualize the cow. It seems like it enables the cow to gain a husband, for example, to enable you to ask questions about the actual cow, Eve, who was was being filmed within it, that we wouldn't normally think to ask when we consider the way in which the cattle industry operates in the present. So do you think the filmmaker is making is enabling us to ask some historical questions about the differences between the agribusiness of the 18th century and agribusiness of the present? Or, is it more of a kind of conceptual, kind of intellectual question of like, what are the consequences of looking at animals that we typically view in aggregate as individual agents within the world.
Yeah. So I think it works in a number of ways. I think Reichardt's really, I keep saying nuanced, but she is really very attentive to the different, she's not really going to come in and sort of agitate against capitalism or agribusiness. I mean, on the one hand, the cow, by being individualized, masks the reality of the dairy industry, and also allows us to, because there's a personal connection with Cookie, it allows us to kind of think that, to overlook the, as I said, the inherent violence that is part and parcel of this, of what's happening even in the film, without bringing in the development of the dairy industry in the States. I think in the relation to colonialism, I think she's more intentional in wanting us to ask questions about, because someone says, and even in the trailer it's mentioned, oh, this is no place for a cow, also no place for a white man. So the film makes an explicit connection between the presence of cows and colonialism. And I think she's more ambivalent about capitalism. I think for her, it is, whether we like it or not, part of the kind of the American psyche, and also in the film, I think it allows people to have dignity, because they're enterprising, because they're good at something, and they can try to, turn it into something that that gives them meaning and profit. I mean, this is a problem with all films about farmed animals that individualize them, including a film like Okja, for example. Even films that are sort of animated or CGI'd, and Gunda and Andrea Arnold's Cow, they all focus on an individual, and it comes with a cost, because I think it helps people feel empathy, and that empathy itself is kind of a way of not fully engaging with the reality of the situation. So I don't think that Reichardt herself is particularly interested in cow welfare, but she is interested in the transformation of the landscape, in the devastation that of in environmental devastation and depletion, which is connected to big agribusiness. So it's complicated. Sorry, it's a long-winded way of saying that I think her sensibilities lie in the environmental. It's an environmental interest rather than an interest in the animal as an individual.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions and comments. And thank you very much, Anat, for a wonderful presentation that I think will stay with a lot of us for a long time. That's it for today's session. And
can I just say one more thing about skeletons? Just one. It's just a reference to a film that just came to mind. So there's another film that is a revision of the Western. It's a much older film from 1996. It's called Lone Star by John Sayles. And it too begins with the unearthing of a skeleton. And that is the jumping off point for a revision of the relationships between classes and races and ethnicities on the Texas-Mexico border. That's it. That's all I wanted to say.
That's great. And what I wanted to say, that maybe if anyone would like to continue this kind of conversation about the issues raised, then probably they can reach out to you directly, right? And continue some of these some of those threads. I wanted to thank everyone for coming, and Anat for your presentation once again. This is the last of this semester's American Collegium series talks. However, we start next semester, so for the students and faculty, be on the lookout for announcements. And I am incredibly happy that this is the kind of talk that the Big Bang kind of finished this semester. So thank you. And now, because of animal welfare, I need to stop this session, because I know that your cats are hungry. And as made obvious by my dog, she is also hungry. So I think that we need to commute with other species. And I wish you all a very pleasant evening. And once again, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.